So welcome to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course once again. And we are working our way through Francesca Fremantle's book, Luminous, Emptiness, on the way to Ponlop Rinpoche's book, Mind in the Bardos. Is that what it's called? Michael?
Mind and Death.
Thank you. As we are studying the death teachings and the Bardos. So Michael is going to lead off tonight. Sir?
Okay, welcome everyone. And yes, we'll be talking about the first two chapters in Luminous Emptiness, Francesca Fremantle's book. A lot of the material in the first chapter, or at least some of it, we covered last week actually. So I'm going to try to just highlight the most important points and just refer back to last week's talk, particularly the section at the end about the nature of Terma teachings. And just fix that. There. And I'm spotlighted for everyone else, but I actually like having the gallery view so I can see more people instead of staring at my own face. Although, well, who knows? So the first chapter is titled The Book of the Living, and in this chapter, Francesca Fremantle, our author, really says quite a bit about some of her intentions in writing this book and what she hopes to convey to us. And so it's important to keep some of these things in mind because it will help us make sense of some of the points that she'll be trying to make later on as we read. But she begins with yet again pointing out to us, as we talked about last week, that the title Tibetan Book of the Dead is somewhat misleading, and that it was actually used when the book was first translated by Evans Wentz as a method of introducing the book because people at that time were already familiar with a different book, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and so it was an attempt to capitalize on familiarity with that text as a way of introducing people to the Bardo Totral. She also points out, and this is consistent with another theme in this chapter, not so hidden theme in this chapter. She was a Buddhist studies scholar, and we got that actually in some of the material we read last week, where she talked about working on her dissertation to translate one of the Tantras. So there's a bit of a scholarly Buddhist studies historical perspective in what she shares in this chapter. And she points out that the Tibetan Book of the Dead was one of the first examples of Vajrayana literature and Tibetan literature translated into English and made available to Westerners. As I say, some of these themes were covered last week. What she says, though, is that it's important to keep in mind that the book is a specialized teaching concerned with advanced meditation practices, but at the same time, it's an expression of a universal truth. And the overall theme that she presents in this chapter, in terms of an overall point of view that we're trying to get across, is the importance of actually being awake in every moment. Or rather, perhaps I should say, the possibility of becoming awake in every moment, because really that is one of the key points in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or she will call it the hearing through liberation, that in spite of, or even because of, all of the fantastic experiences that might occur in the in-between, the Bardo state, the intermediary state, there's always a possibility to wake up. So she says that her purpose is to for this book to serve as a guide to understanding the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or Hearing Through Liberation, by explaining in detail the concepts on which it's based, the terms it uses, and the imagery it contains. So that's one of the things that she intends to do for us, or help us do. And she goes again, asks us again, should it even be called the Book of the Dead? Because again, the Tibetan name, or a direct translation of the Tibetan, would be the Great Liberation Through Hearing During the Intermediate State. So while it obviously does address death and dying, and it's actually read aloud in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, it's actually read aloud to the dying and the dead to guide them, hopefully, successfully through the Bardo states, but that it's also for the living. And they say, altogether, this book is just one more of the many, many wake-up calls that we encounter in studying Buddhism. But that's really the point of this text, is that we could wake up, and that we could wake up now. As she says, it's a book for the living. And so I'd say it's a call to wake up. As she says, in another sense, we who think of ourselves as the living could really be called the dead. We are the unawakened, living our lives in a dream that will continue after death, then through life after life until we truly awaken. So that it's a book not just for the dead and dying, but a book for us as well, the living, to help us recognize something, universal truths about life and experience and the nature of samsaric existence and the possibility of liberation from samsara. So she says that she'll call it The Liberation Through Hearing and present it as a book for the living. She will, because, among other reasons, that the ideas, the visions, the insight it contains, I'm quoting the author here, the ideas, the visions, the insights it contains can have no genuine, effective significance for us if we approach them only as descriptions of what happens after death. And if we do not understand that they apply to us here and now in our everyday lives. So, consistent with Trungpa Rinpoche's teaching, one of the most vital things we can do in our study, one of the things that will really enliven our study and understanding of Buddhist teachings, is to understand that the Dharma is not external to us in any way, that it's personal and immediate experience, and that the more we understand what we read in that way and reflect on our lives in that way, the more powerful the teachings are. That so long as we think of them as something out there and we're here, then that really reduces their effectiveness. It's when we come to understand Dharma as personal experience, that this is true of us and our lives here and now. That's when it really takes on its power. So she said that she quotes Trungpa Rinpoche as saying that the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Liberation Through Hearing, the Bardo Totral, could also be called the Book of Birth, as its whole point is the fundamental principle of birth and death recurring constantly in this life. And that's one of the things we talked about last week, that in fact we go through a process of birth and death continuously in our lives, that the self that we felt we were this morning is different from the self that we feel we are now. That we have different perceptions, we have different feelings, we have different motivations. We see, as I said before, we see this happen in meditation practice. We begin with the intention to simply rest in present awareness, and within a few minutes we're drifting or distracted, lost in thought, and then we come back again. So that what we take to be a solid, continuous self, in fact, is constantly changing, constantly impermanent. Constantly responsive and part of a vast interconnection of causes and conditions. It's always changing. And so for that reason, the fundamental principle of this book is that birth and death recur constantly in this life. The author says, the sense of self in each one of us, the I, is being born and dying every moment. The whole of existence, the entire world of our experience, is appearing and disappearing every moment. So we should ask ourselves, do we feel this is true? Or in what way do we feel this is true? And if we do feel this is true, why don't we see it this way most of the time? So that's something for us to contemplate. I will share with you one of my answers to that, which actually came out of trying to understand something of the dream experience and trying to experience lucid dream. And the question that I was asking myself is, why, when I have situations occur in a dream that are completely illogical and impossible, for instance, when I was working full-time and dealing with multiple crises all at once, many times on the job, I would have a recurring dream at night of being driving a car, or sometimes being a passenger in a car, but most often driving, and then suddenly finding myself in the back seat with no driver in the front seat, which is a metaphor. Does a really good job of describing how I felt on the job sometimes. But never once in the dream did it occur to me, how did I get back here? That's not what happens. And I realized the reason why it doesn't is in that moment of panic. I'm going to crash, I'm going to die, something bad is going to happen. that I forget completely about the previous moment. And I think more than I realize with that, that actually happens to us in our daily life quite a bit. We forget from moment to moment what we were experiencing a moment before. And suddenly all that seems real is how we've constructed the present moment of experience. And we forget the construction that dissolved, that just faded away of the previous moment. So we go from moment to moment of being completely absorbed, completely caught up in the constructions of habitual mind, and forget that just a moment before, or moments before, we were completely caught up in perceiving, thinking about something completely different. So that we forget that, in fact, this self, as she says, is being born and dying every moment, because we get so caught up in the drama and the panic of the moment. Anyway, but that may not be, that's just something to think about. If we accept that this is true, and certainly this is what the Buddha taught, and what every teacher since in the lineage has taught, I think we could contemplate a little bit. Why don't we see it that way? And most of the time it's because we're so caught up in our thinking that we're not really paying attention to our experience. What happens in death, she says, is a continuation of what is happening to us now in this life, even though it manifests in unfamiliar ways. And there's an intriguing line, as the text says, she quotes the Tibetan Book of the Dead text, quote, "Samsara is reversed and everything appears as light and images." So this is one of the passages in this book that samsara is reversed, that I actually was going to go back and look through my copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but I realized I didn't have time. And I actually think that probably comes from the introduction that Trungpa Rinpoche wrote, rather than as a line exactly in the text. But it's something interesting to think about. And I think what it means is that at the moment of, in the moment of death, and in the experience of Dharmata in particular, that in that moment we have a non-dual, direct experience of luminous emptiness. That luminous emptiness, the title of this book, is the true nature of mind. Luminous in the sense of there being some kind of clarity, awareness, appearance, and empty in the sense that it in no way is fixed or graspable, that in no way is bound by reference points. Even though in our common everyday experience we do get bound up in reference points, and for that reason don't realize the real vastness and the real clarity of luminous emptiness. In other words, it's an experience of the true nature of mind. And that clearly in the death experience, all appearances are mind itself. That everything is, all of what appears. But that this is also true in life as well. So she says, well, that in the bardo of dharmata, the bardo of becoming, the intermediate states, we'll perceive the same world in a different way. She also says if we progress far enough, we'll experience it directly through meditation. But she makes an important point. It's only in this life that we have the opportunity to prepare ourselves. Without the grounding influence of the physical body, events will overtake us with such speed and intensity that there will be no chance to stop and meditate. So that's the experience in the bardo. That without the grounding influence of the physical body, events will overtake us with such speed and intensity that there will be no chance to stop and meditate. And with that, I actually wanted to share just a piece from a teaching on the bardo by Trungpa Rinpoche, because it gets at exactly why this physical grounding, our precious human birth, is so important, and the importance of practice now. In this, Trungpa Rinpoche asks, what is the principal practice that we should be doing in our present state, the natural bardo between birth and death, to prepare ourselves for death? The most obvious difference between this state, or this bardo, where we are now, this is us now, between this bardo and, for example, the bardo of becoming, which occurs after death, is in the quality of the appearances which arise. The appearances which arise to us now, no matter how unstable our minds may be, are grounded in our physical bodies. Being so grounded causes a stability of place and location. The stability of place and location. For example, in our present state, when we think of some place other than where we are, our minds will still stay where we are because our minds are held here by our bodies. Therefore, in this present bardo, the natural bardo between birth and death, appearances are characterized by a stability produced by our physical groundedness. However, in the bardo of becoming, because the body and mind have separated, and the mind is therefore no longer physically grounded, the mind is unstable. When the mind thinks of a place, it immediately finds itself there. Then again, thinking of some other place, it finds itself at that other place. So the mind is unstable in the bardo of becoming. Even if it wishes to, it cannot stay in one place. Therefore, the practice of meditation in this life, in our present state of physical groundedness, will help us in that future bardo a great deal. If you practice meditation during your life, then the principal benefit that you can gain is control over your mind and freedom of mind. If you do not practice meditation, then you will not be able to send the mind to a chosen place or to hold the mind on a chosen object in the bardo. Through the practice of meditation, you gain the ability to apply your mind to a chosen object or state of mind and to hold it there. This produces a stability of mind which is very helpful after death in the bardo of becoming, in which the only stability is produced by mental stability and not by physical groundedness that is in this present life. So, nothing else I say tonight. The importance of meditation practice for helping us develop some stability of mind. Let alone, and in this case he's really just talking about the experience of shamatha, that with vipassana we come to be increasingly able to recognize the true nature of mind, that what we experience, what we perceive, is mind, is our minds, and that it's this recognition that actually is true liberation in the bardo. So again, the practice we're doing now is extremely helpful and valuable to each one of us. So to go back to Luminous Emptiness, again, it's a book of, she says that a book of living is not to lessen the importance of contemplating the certainty of death, that meditation on death, on the ephemeral nature of this life, and the inevitable consequences of our actions remains fundamental throughout the whole of the Buddhist path. She says that she has no intention of explaining away rebirth in the six realms as allegory or reduced visions of the deities who are the living presence of the awakened state, the psychological archetypes. She says, quote, "On the contrary, being able to see them all in terms of this life gives an immediate relevance and rescues them from the dangers of becoming mere fantasy." And says that such an attitude, in other words, realizing again that all of these experiences, all the descriptions of the realms and the deities have application to us now, and that such an attitude provides tremendous motivation and inspiration for practice. She then asks, and this is where we begin to get into her perspective, again, I think, as a Buddhist studies scholar and historian. But she asks, do all Buddhists believe in what is presented in the Book of the Dead, the Hearing Through Liberation? And she says really only a small minority of the totality of Buddhist population in the world do. That the notion that there's a dissolution of the body and that there's rebirth in accordance with one's previous actions or karma, that's accepted by all schools of Buddhism. But the notion of these transitory or bardo, intermediary states, is not present in all schools of Buddhism. And with that, she gets into some discussion of the nature of belief in Buddhism and the place of liberation through the book Liberation Through Hearing and its history. As she says, and this point is made again and again by different teachers that I've heard, that the Buddha didn't teach a dogma. He offered a path based on understanding and personal experience rather than a creed. His own spiritual search was one of constant questioning and experimentation. That in fact the Buddha taught to specific people at specific times and gave them the instruction that was most clearly helpful given on their aspirations and capabilities, but that it was not presented as an organized system of teaching the way that we experience it today, that came later. That in fact when the Buddha began, he was actually reluctant to teach, and he never asked anyone to believe in what he said, but only to try it out for themselves. Actually, with a lot of this section, it was helpful to me in reading this part of the book to have read Old Path, White Clouds, the Thich Nhat Hanh book that we've talked about before, because it really does a very good job of giving a feeling of the atmosphere in which the Buddha taught and the nature of the Buddha's teachings at that time. I'll also say about that book that even though it presents the very traditional Hinayana teachings that the Buddha gave, that it does so in such a way that it's really not hard at all to see how the Mahayana and Vajrayana teachings and understanding developed out of that. That it's not hard at all to see how the Buddha's teachings on impermanence and interdependence or codependent or karma really lead to an understanding of emptiness, and that the Buddha's teachings on awareness and the nature of awareness really clearly carry all the way through the path. But in any case, she makes the point that the Buddha often didn't answer questions or maintained silence, and that the truth that the Buddha taught ultimately, that the Buddha realized, the truths that the Buddha realized were actually beyond words and beyond concept, and so actually difficult to put into words, so that sometimes he didn't answer questions. And that he could convey truth simply by his presence, which is, by the way, how she described her experience of Trungpa Rinpoche in the preface that we read last week. And she said as a result of that, and I think again, this is where some of her, the Buddhist studies, Buddhist scholar background comes through, that in fact there have been misunderstandings of Buddhism in the West because of some of the difficulty that that we could encounter in terms of understanding the Buddha's teachings. She says that Buddhism has sometimes falsely been presented as world-rejecting, agnostic, and even nihilistic. I remember reading early on the descriptions of Buddhism as a pessimistic religion because of the Buddha's emphasis on the nature of suffering. And in fact, it's not pessimistic at all. The emphasis on basic goodness or Buddha nature is in fact tremendously positive. And a true understanding of suffering is just purely helping us to wake up, and that it's not that as a pessimistic or nihilistic religion at all. But it was sometimes understood that way because of some of the challenges in understanding the Buddha's teaching. She says that later forms, by which she means the Mahayana and Vajrayana teachings, appear to go into in the opposite extreme of being almost too fantastic in terms of what they describe, and as a result are not accepted as genuine by followers of some Buddhist traditions. That there are Hinayana traditions that don't accept the Mahayana and Vajrayana teachings at all. But I think the most important point that she makes is that above all, Buddhism is a religion of practical methods for spiritual realization, and that's really how we have to approach it. It's said that the Buddha presented 84,000 dharmas. And as she says, they can seem contradictory if we don't understand the context of the teachings, but that in fact they're just different points of view from which to approach the same truth. And so with that, then she goes into a review of the three yanas, which we talked about before, but she discusses them first in terms of their historical development, beginning with the Hinayana, based on the actual words of the Buddha. And talked about after the Buddha's parinirvana, division into different monastic sects, again, based on the fact that Buddha traveled all around India and taught in different ways to different people based on their needs and aspirations. And that now the only sect that truly exists is the Theravada in Southeast Asia. She says that, again, in terms of its historical development, that beginning with the 1st century BCE, that the Mahayana sutras began to be presented and studied in India. And she says the sutras, quote, were believed to have been taught by the Buddha during his life, but since people were not ready to hear them, they were entrusted to serpent deities and other semi-divine beings until the time was right. So this is getting into the teachings of Nagarjuna, the founder of Madhyamaka, who got the Prajnaparamita Sutras from the Nagas, the serpent deities, but that these teachings were originally given by the Buddha in the Mahayana tradition. Mahayana was called the Great Way, in contrast to the Hinayana way, which is seen as inferior, which mostly relates, as she says, to different views of liberation. We studied this. The Hinayana emphasizes individual liberation, whereas the Mahayana proclaims the possibility and the necessity of developing compassion for all beings and liberating all beings. And then the third phase of Vajrayana, which she says historically seems to date to about the 7th century AD in India. And she says in this text that it's not considered separate from Mahayana, but a special section of it, which was interesting because I remember a talk Trungpa Rinpoche gave where he was talking about different scholars and different Buddhist studies scholars in the West, and said that there were some who would say that Vajrayana wasn't Buddhism at all, and he felt that they were utterly wrong, needless to say, utterly wrong. But that there were others who described Vajrayana as an advanced form of Mahayana, and he said that really wasn't wrong. That was not wrong, and that basically these teachings were received and preserved in Tibet, and a lot of this has to do with accidents of history and geography, but that it's there where the complete heritage of Indian Buddhism is preserved. She says that she feels that this historical perspective can be misleading, especially if one tries to label existing schools as only belonging to one yana or another. And again, this is, well, as she says, this is again a quote directly from the chapter. If we look at these teachings as they are recorded in the Pali scriptures, we find many passages to support the evolution leading to Mahayana and Vajrayana. And again, this is where Old Path, White Clouds, the book by Thich Nhat Hanh, makes that very clear. It's really not hard at all to see how the very foundational teachings by the Buddha just naturally lead to the ideas of Buddha nature or awakened mind and emptiness, luminous emptiness that are characteristic of the Vajrayana. And then she said you can actually, it's more sort of dropping the scholar, Buddhist studies, historian role, and more into a practical application role, that you could also look at the three yanas in terms of spiritual progress, spiritual development. And this is clearly how Trungpa Rinpoche taught. For those of you who've been with us through reading the Profound Treasury, Trungpa Rinpoche taught all three yanas and made very clear that the Hinayana was a necessary foundation for studying Mahayana, and that development of Mahayana compassion and some understanding of emptiness and Buddha nature was also absolutely necessary to understand Vajrayana, so that they're not in any way in opposition, but rather a process of development or evolution through the three yanas. And she just goes through just a very brief summary in just a few pages of what really is a vast amount of material. But that again, that the Hinayana is foundational and preparatory. One of Trungpa Rinpoche's slogans at one of the seminaries was "Never forget the Hinayana," because it's so important to develop a foundation of discipline and renunciation. As she says, it's a path where we make friends with ourselves and learn not to be a nuisance to ourselves and others, that we come to some understanding that we need to help ourselves before we can help others, otherwise we just perpetuate confusion. And she describes it as a path of simplicity and renunciation, where worldly attractions and temptations are regarded as obstacles to be avoided, and where we practice shamatha to tame the mind and vipassana to develop insight, which ultimately leads to the discovery of selflessness or egolessness, the lack of a ongoing, solid, permanent self that somehow has some kind of existence. And she felt that this opening naturally leads to the Mahayana, that we begin to see the world as a quote, boundless web of interconnections embracing the whole of time and space. And for that reason, individual liberation seems incomplete. And we develop the motivation and the compassion to try to liberate all beings, the desire to attain Buddhahood, so that we have the ability and the wisdom and the skillfulness to save all beings. or as she says, with the space and with the space and relaxation of struggle that comes with realizing egolessness or selflessness, we begin to see others as more important than ourselves, and compassion becomes the motivating force for our practice. And with this, we begin to see with even the Mahayana that sensual pleasures are not hindrances in themselves, that they can be purified, which means essentially letting go of ego attachment and ego motivation, and enjoyed as offerings. That the path becomes celebration at this point. That the as Tilopa's famous teaching to Naropa, it's not appearances that bind you, it's attachment that binds you. And that when we're able to truly be free of ego, then the circumstances in the world that we might on the Hinayana level see as temptations and distractions actually become fuel for practice. That really anything and everything can wake us up, which is ultimately what Vajrayana is about. Vajrayana goes even further, that everything is integrated into practice. So again, everything could be an experience that wakes us up, anything at all. And that with Vajrayana we practice transmutation. The body, and we see body and mind as divine, basic goodness, and the world's transformed into sacred world. And we begin to see kleshas, the wisdom aspect of kleshas. Again, it's not the kleshas themselves that are wisdom, but the essence of kleshas. Just as it says in the chant, the essence of thoughts is dharmakaya. We begin to see that nature in things, so that everything becomes practice. She says that, quote, the methods of Vajrayana are based on identifying oneself and the whole of one's experiences with the qualities of enlightenment, which are brought to life in the form of all the peaceful and wrathful deities. And with that, the awakened state can manifest everywhere in every aspect of existence. And then finally, at the final stage, the innermost essence of Tantra, the very heart, lies the recognition that we have never been anything other than awakened. So with this, the practitioner lives in a condition of complete simplicity and direct experience of reality. So again, it's that the question is, do we recognize our enlightened nature or not? And with the Vajrayana, we realize that in fact that's what we always were, always have been. And she says that these are revolutionary ideas historically. She goes back to a historical Buddhist studies scholar perspective, that Hinayanas refused to hear some of these teachings, and that, but from a Vajrayana perspective, all of them are different aspects of one single path. She then talks just a little bit about the imagery in Vajrayana, and says that there's a danger of becoming fascinated and misled, that may lead to belief based on wishful thinking rather than direct experience. So that's the point. The point is to actually have a genuine experience of the true nature of mind, not a contrived or conceptually created one. And that also a misunderstanding of imagery can lead to fear of going deeper. And she says, this is why it's important to look carefully into the genuine meaning and purpose of these images during life to appreciate their potential significance for us after death. And again, just states that it's her intention to relate the symbolic world of Vajrayana to the non-tantric Buddhist teachings and to the experiences of everyday life. So we need these foundations to understand Tantra, but this is what she'll be presenting in this first section of the book, some of the foundational understanding we need in order to grasp the meaning of the images, concepts, and ideas that are presented in Vajrayana and in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So that's the end of the first chapter, so I will actually stop there, and we can at least begin with the next chapter, which is, actually has quite a bit in it. John, you're muted.
That's not the end of the chapter as I have it here.
Right, I forgot.
There's quite a lot more.
Well, there's the next section really is a lot about the Terma tradition that we talked about last week. I forgot to mention that. I had it here and it skipped over my notes. that we talked last week about the introduction of Vajrayana to Tibet through Padmasambhava or Padmakara, and that a lot of his, he tamed the obstructing forces in Tibet, but that the Dharma teachings were teachings that people were not yet ready to hear, and so that he and Yeshe Tsogyal hid a number of teachings as terma, hidden teachings, and that there are. We talked about this a little bit last week, but there are two kinds of terma: earth treasures, which are literally some kind of physical representation, sometimes a text and sometimes an object, and mind terma, which were direct transmissions of a particular teaching to a particular kirtan or treasure discoverer.
Okay.
And that Karma Lingpa, who is the person who received the Tibetan Book of the Dead teachings, was one such Turtan. That Padmasambhava came to Tibet in the 8th century, um, but that the Terma teachings really didn't begin to appear in Tibet until the 11th century, because if you remember, there was dying out of the lineage that actually supported uh, the introduction of Buddhism in Tibet. And then when the interest recurred again, and we began having people like Marpa in the Kagyu tradition going to India to receive teachings, and the development of the other lineages, the Sakya and the Gelugpa, that at that point the Terma teachings began to manifest in the
So
minds of.
Michael,
Yes.
I think I'll just pick up where you left off and,
Okay.
fin- and finish this chapter.
Okay.
Okay?
Fine.
Unless you want to do it yourself.
No, no, that's good. We covered a lot of it last week, but if there's some points that you think we should go over, or something that, something more that we could add, I think that would be fine.
Okay. Um, I had prepared the second chapter, but we'll work on that next week, I guess. The methods of Vajrayana are based on identifying oneself and the whole of one's experience with the qualities of enlightenment. This is what Vajrayana is all about. And these qualities are brought to life in the forms of the peaceful and wrathful deities, which we will encounter more when we study. There are the three death bardos. The first one is the painful bardo of dying, when your body falls apart and then your mind as well, and you actually die. And there's a description of this. It's different than in the Western world, where it's assumed that when the body shuts down, you're dead. But in Buddhism, they say that when the body shuts down, the mind is still there. And it divides into three parts. The aggression, which is contained in the thoughts that reside in the head; passion, which is contained in thoughts which reside in the chakra that 4 finger breadths below the navel; and ignorance, which is in the heart. And the thoughts that reside in the head are white, aggression, and they descend through the central channel to the heart. The thoughts that reside in the secret channel below your waist are passionate, and they're red, and they arise and come up to the heart. And when they meet, they then dissolve into the black thoughts of ignorance, stupidity. These are the three poisons. And at that point, you have an opportunity to awaken completely and achieve full enlightenment if you've prepared. But most people haven't. So they then proceed into the next bardo, which again, most people hardly even notice because they haven't prepared enough. But if they have, it's the bardo of reality, the bardo of dharmata in Sanskrit. In Tibetan, it's called the Chuni bardo, which means the bardo of dharmata. Ch is dharma, ni is essence, like dharmata. And in this bardo, one sees the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities, which represent enlightened mind. One also sees the 6 realms, which represent neurotic mind. And they say that you are drawn towards the 6 realms. They're easier to look at. Their lights are not as bright and offensive. and difficult to see, watch, whereas the lights connected with the peaceful and wrathful deities are very fierce, bright, vivid, hard to see, hard to look at. Even the peaceful deities are this way. And so that you are cautioned not to be drawn towards the easier lights, the lights of the bardos, but to stay with the peaceful and wrathful deities. And one can achieve enlightenment in the bardo of reality, a bardo of dharmata, as one can anywhere. But it's easier here than it will become in the third bardo, which is the bardo of becoming. And this is typically the 49-day bardo that we've heard so much about, where you see yourself in the body of a child, first the child you were, maybe 6 or 7 years old, and then the child you're going to become, maybe 6 or 7 years old. And you're wandering through this bardo of becoming, which is described very much like a dream state. It's purely mental, and you know what happens in a dream. Everything can change on a dime, just like that. And it's the same in the bardo of becoming. It's very, very changeable, rapidly so. And you can go from peaceful states to very wrathful or unpeaceful states in an instant, just as you can in life. So it's very much like a dream state. In fact, Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche, the teacher abroad these days, once said that if you want to experience something like the bardo of becoming when you're in this dream state that's very changeable and fierce, he said, go meditate in Times Square in New York in the middle of the day. And if any of you know what Times Square is like, it's a crossroads. It's where Broadway and a whole bunch of other streets intersect. And at the heart of Times Square, there's this booth where they sell tickets to Broadway shows. These are tickets that the shows weren't able to sell, and they're available at the last minute. And people queue up to buy them at reduced rates. And that's right in the middle. And meanwhile, cars, trucks, everything is roaring by. And there are huge billboards, multi-storied, 5, 10 stories high with flashing lights. And twice, I and members of the New York Dharmadhatu went and did that. We sat in Times Square right by that booth. We took our meditation zabutons and cushions, our gamdens, and at noon sat there. About 10 or 12 of us or so, 10, 15 people sat there, and people just streamed by, It was chaos. And this is what Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche says the bardo of becoming is like, that last bardo before you take rebirth, a dream state. And then, according to your karma, you are propelled into rebirth, hopefully. Rebirth as a human being. If you are, you will see your mother and father copulating. You will look down from the bardo of becoming and see them copulating. And if you're attracted to the male, you're going to be reborn as a female. And if you're attracted to the female, you're going to be reborn as a male. And at that point, you enter the mother's womb and become an embryo and start to proceed through the 9 months of gestation towards birth. So he talks here about this tantric path. This is of becoming. He says, the key language of Vajrayana and the symbolism we find in liberation through hearing. The tantric path is divided into 4 or 6 stages, depending upon which tradition one follows. If you follow the Kagyu sect, it's divided into 4 subsects, 4 divisions, ending in Mahamudra. If you follow the Nyingma sect, it's divided into 6, ending in the great path of Dzogchen. But neither one of them really teaches or practices these days the early ones. So for instance, in the Nyingma tradition, the first 3 yanas of the Nyingma tradition, first three divisions aren't really practiced. They go right to the last three, which are Mahayoga, Anu, and Ati. And in any event, you wind up in the end, the last stage. He says, at the final stage, the innermost essence of Vajrayana, the very heart of Tantra, there lies the recognition that we have never been anything other than awakened. This is the awakening, the true awakening, that we have never been anything other than that. Here there is no longer any need for techniques, for symbolism, or for transformation. The practitioner who has accomplished the path lives in a condition of complete simplicity and the direct experience of reality. And our practice of shamatha and vipassana, especially the vipassana, is what is leading us to this state. Because vipassana is relaxation into reality, awareness, complete understanding of this, without any feeling that anything is lacking. And this is what is described. At the Dzogchen path, this is the last stage of Dzogchen, and there are several stages. He says the text contains stories that show how revolutionary some of these ideas were perceived to be and how practitioners of the time rejected them. When the Vajrayana was expounded in the Tantras, even the Bodhisattvas fainted in fear and had to be revived by rays of light shining out from the hearts of all the Buddhas. The sutras of Mahayana and the tantras of Vajrayana simply unfold in their own special ways of vision, already inherent in the Buddha's own words. This is the vision of effortless resting in reality. They drew out to the fullest extent various aspects of his teachings that had not been emphasized previously, because they could not be understood completely in accordance with the prevailing circumstances and conditions. He says it is important to look into and understand the exotic, complicated images of Tantric Buddhism during our lives in order to appreciate their potential significance for us after death, rather than to be fascinated by the exotic or bewildered by it. And we will, because we can, if we have meditated enough in this life, see the Bardo of Dharmata in all of its extraordinary vividness and color. She says Francesca's intention in this book is to relate the symbolic world of Vajrayana both to the non-tantric Buddhist teachings and to the experience of everyday life. Liberation through hearing belongs to the highest stages of the Vajrayana. Liberation through hearing, this is the title, this is the translation of the title which Evans Wentz changed to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He wanted to sell it, and the Egyptian Book of the Dead was very popular, so he co-opted that title and made it the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But the real translation, the real title of this text is the Bardo Turdal. Bardo is the interval. Bar means from, do means to, bar, do, from, to. So it's an interval, and there are 6 intervals, 6 bardos. There are actually many. There's the bardo of this class. But there are 6 main bardos, the bardo of this life, which contains 2 sub-bardos, the bardo of meditation and the bardo of dreams. And then after the bardo of this life, there is the painful bardo of dying, which I've already described, the painful bardo of Dharmata, which has the peaceful and wrathful deities and the realms in it. And then finally, the bardo of becoming, when we are wandering through 49 days, supposedly. It's figurative because there really is no time. You have no body, no physical world. And you take rebirth, hopefully as a human being. Why I say hopefully? Because it's only as a human being that you can tread the path to enlightenment. You can't do it as an animal, much less as a hungry ghost or a hell being. And the gods, both jealous and above that, are too blissed out and stupid to tread the path to enlightenment. It's only humans who have the right combination of intelligence and suffering that motivates them to tread the path. It says, So liberation through hearing is Bardo Tu Dal Tu is hearing, Dal is liberation. So it's liberation through hearing in the Bardo. What's essential, Trungpa Rinpoche says, is the development of selflessness and compassion. He says, trying to practice Vajrayana without compassion is like swimming in molten lead. It is deadly. So selflessness and compassion, this is really coming to the two main principles of understanding reality, selflessness. Another word for this could be shunyata, that one sees this world as it truly is, not as a collection of existing things, but as a constant flexing, appearing and disappearing, instant by instant, as these words, these gestures, all of it appears and disappears. And the compassion comes from the feeling of, number one, of resonance with this world, of joy, of love for this life. And number two, of wanting to help other sentient beings awaken into the world of reality. So the first part of this book that we're reading is intended to provide an infrastructure of basic information. It is not a comprehensive account of Buddhism, but only introduces us to those aspects that are particularly relevant as a guide for further exploration of liberation through hearing, of the Bardo Tu Dal. The second part of the book will go through the text itself, bringing these principles into relationship with it. And that's where we will also study Ponlop Rinpoche, because he's really terrific in Mind Beyond Death. So the provenance, then he goes through the provenance of this book, which Michael touched on a bit. I'm going to do it a little more. And we're probably going to end with this chapter this time. Liberation through hearing came into existence in its present form in the 14th century. Karma Lingpa was a terton who received this as a terma from Padmasambhava, who lived in the 8th century, 600 years before. There's actually these teachings first appeared maybe even as early as the 3rd century in Tibet, but definitely by the 7th century with Songtsen Gampo, who had more than one wife who was Tibetan, who was a Buddhist. And at that time, there was no written language in Tibet, as I've said before, so he sent his minister to India and brought back the Sanskrit alphabet. And they started using that to write the Tibetan language, just the way we use the Roman Latin alphabet to write English, Spanish, Italian, and so forth. In the 8th century, the great king Trisong Detsen had a Buddhist wife and was converted to Buddhism, and he sent for a teacher to India. And we've gone over this, but I'll just mention it again. The one who came was named Shantarakshita, and he was a Mahayanist, and he couldn't really deal with the wild fierceness of Tibet. And he told Trisong Detsen, the king, you need to get somebody with more power than me. And he recommended Padmasambhava, Padmakara, as Rinpoche prefers to call him. They both mean the same thing, basically born from a lotus, a Padma. Padmakara means arisen from a lotus, Padmasambhava means born from a lotus. So this is the earlier diffusion of Dharma in Tibet, the time of Padmasambhava, versus what happened in the 12th century. Because what happened was that after Padmasambhava, later in the 9th century, Buddhism was suppressed, and then after a while it came back. And it especially came back when Marpa, the translator, got the idea that he was going to make a lot of money by bringing Buddhist teachings from India and selling them. And he went to India. He traveled to India overland in the 1100s and brought back Buddhist teachings. He did this twice. And then after him, the Sakya sect came from India as well, and then finally the Gelugpa sect in the 14th century. Um, yeah. Padmakara was born as an 8-year-old child in the middle of the lake of Danakosha in Udayana, in what's now called the Swat Valley in today's northern Pakistan. And what this basically means is that enlightenment is born full-fold. It doesn't just suddenly, develop little by little. Bang! Here he was, fully enlightened as an 8-year-old child. It says little is known about him historically, but his spiritual influence was enormous. He became revered as the most important figure in Tibetan Buddhism, though there were others too. So, for instance, Vimalamitra became very important, Sri Singha, and others when we go through the Nyingma lineage. And these people who descended from Padmasambhava, this is the Nyingma sect. Nyingma means old ones. And as opposed to the other sects that developed later, the Kagyu sect. Kagyu means the lineage of the word. Ka is sound or word, and Gyu is lineage. And then the Sakya and the Gelugpa sect, and I don't know their etymologies. So he's also known as Guru Rinpoche, the precious teacher, Padmasambhava. He's regarded especially by Tibetans, as the second Buddha, inseparable from the historical Buddha Shakyamuni himself, taking human form once more in order to teach the Tantras this time. So through the work of Guru Rinpoche and his colleagues, Tibet received all the streams of Buddhism that existed in India: monastic, philosophical, yogic, and magical. During the next century, 9 to 1100s, the line of kings descended from Songtsen Gampo dies out, and Tibet fell under the sway. I've already gone through this, I'm sorry. So Padmasambhava realized that Tibetans were not really ready for the full download, and he hid Terma with the assistance of his consort, Yeshe Tsogyal, who embodies the feminine principle of inspiration and communication, which is of great importance in Tantra. Padmasambhava made many predictions about these Terma and their Tertans. The Tertans are, of course, the finders of Terma. All of the Tertans have a particular connection to Padmakara, and in many cases are the reincarnations of his close disciples. This is similar to the Mahayana teachings. And Trungpa Rinpoche was a Tertan. We just knew him as a Tertan by his revelation of the Shambhala teachings, which were mind terma. They came to him in his mind, and he wrote them down. Later, we learned from other teachers after Trungpa Rinpoche died, who came from Tibet, that in Tibet, Trungpa Rinpoche was a Tertan there as well, and he discovered many earth terma as well as mind terma. And there are teachers who have brought these earth terma to us. And maybe at some point we'll study some of them. So Trungpa Rinpoche emphasized the importance of the Tertan's role. They are not just intermediaries, but great teachers who, through their own experience and realization, bring into living form the practices of the teachings they discover. And this is the case with many Tertans. And there were especially some great Tertans in the 1900s, the 19th century, the 1800s. Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, who was reborn, among others, as Dugel Khyentse Rinpoche, Chokyur Lingpa, and we'll come to him at some point. Actually, there's a teaching that's going to be given very soon on a text by Chokyur Lingpa by Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche. And Jamgon Kongtrul Lodro Taye, Jamgon Kongtrul the Great. All three were Tertans in the 1900s into the 20th century. He says the important point is that the Tertan makes a direct connection with Padmakara's eternally present nature, and thus receives his inspiration. So this is especially the Nyingma tradition of Kama, the word, and Terma, the revealed treasure. Liberation through hearing, the Book of the Dead, is part of a large collection discovered by the Tibetan Karma Lingpa. Okay, we've discovered it. We've covered him. And he was contemporaneous with Longchenpa and largely with Jetsun Sengi Wangchuk too. Karma Lingpa was supposedly a reincarnation of Louis Gyeltsen of Chogro, one of Padmakara's 25 disciples. Padmakara had 25 main disciples, a number of whom were translators. And Karma Lingpa was a reincarnation of one of those. So this is interesting. According to a tradition related by Chogyam Trungpa, Karma Lingpa discovered these teachings, the Book of the Dead, the Bardo Tudol, after the death of his child, closely followed by the death of his wife. This would fit in with the central point about Terma teachings, that essentially they are drawn forth from the hearts of their discoverers under the influence of conditions. This is what Trungpa Rinpoche said. And there's been more than one instance where death, the death of a person's family, a teacher's family, inspired them to find these terma. And one of the special requirements for the discovery of terma is the inspiration of the feminine principle, just as it was necessary for their concealment. The great majority of tertans have been men, and generally they are accompanied by their wives or female companions. Sometimes these termas are not made public right away. The conditions may not be right. People may not be ready for them, and further instructions may be needed to be revealed to clarify their meaning. Often, the tertan himself has to practice them for many years, and this is the case with a lot of terma, that they were practiced for many, many years by a single individual and then finally revealed and given. All right, we're almost finished here. So liberation through hearing was one of these. It was passed on as what's called a single lineage transmission, which means that it went from one person to one person to one person for a long time. And it's associated now with other texts that spread widely, and it has remained extremely popular in spite of its esoteric nature. Yeah, and this is an interesting point. Trungpa Rinpoche translated this as though it were one text, but actually there is no single Tibetan title corresponding to the Bardo Tudol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's been handed down through the centuries in a variety of versions, ranging from 10 to 38 titles. It says the Tibetan Book of the Dead as we now know it in English consists of two comparatively long texts on the Bardo of Dharmata. Remember the Bardo in which we see the peaceful and wrathful deities? And it also includes the Bardo of Dying and the Bardo of Existence. They are called Great Liberation Through Hearing, the Supplication of the Bardo of Dharmata, and Great Liberation Through Hearing, the Supplication Pointing Out the Bardo of Existence. So, that's that. And I think we're going to save the second chapter, obviously, for next week, because it's as long as this one and has a lot more in it that you are unfamiliar with. So we could open this up for conversation and questions. I hope it wasn't too repetitive.
I was just going to share that one of the things that supposedly makes the bardo of becoming so really difficult is that there's actually tremendous hope and fear around uh, having a body and finding a rebirth. And that because of that, there's tremendous distortion, or there can be, if the person does not practice, that they can become totally caught up in open fear and misperceive the circumstances they're going to be born into. The example that Ed Podpal, one of the teachers at Naropa, used to give was you think you're going to be born in a palace and you wake up in a dog kennel.
Wake up with a what?
In a dog kennel. There's a
What?
dog in a dog kennel.
Yeah.
But it's that level of, again, if there's no practice, if mind just runs wild, and um, I think about different circumstances in my life. Think about relationships we've gotten into or dealings that we've had where hope and fear has gotten the better of us, and we misperceive what we're actually getting ourselves into. And that happens very intensely in the bardo of becoming if we're not able to have some stability of mind.
Which is why it's so important for all of us to be practicing now. We are preparing for this, and especially the practice of Vipassana, aided by the practice of shamatha. Shamatha brings you back. And then the practice of Vipassana is the ultimate practice. It extends all the way through the Vajrayana yanas, through into the very end of Mahamudra, into the very end of Dzogchen, great perfection. It just deepens and transforms you, and you become more and more here, now, resting in this space through the practice of Vipassana. So what we're doing twice a day is key, absolutely key, and with other practices that we'll do as well. Vicky.
I have a question about what you were talking about with the let's see, I'll figure out how to say this. How did they know, and who said this so that we know that when you talk about the three poisons coming from the top of the head and then underneath the belly and then into the heart, that's the moment of death, the white, red, and black. How do we know that? I mean, that moment of death, it's fascinating to me. How did that get transmitted? Is it souls who actually got enlightened, got there at the right moment? So few of, obviously so few do. Just wonder how that knowledge came around so clearly.
Michael?
I'll take a stab at it. I mean, ultimately, we don't. We just have our experience. So we're forced to, or left in the position of taking the word of teachers who are perhaps capable of understanding things that we're not able to understand. I think that it's both comes from descriptions of people who have gone through the dying process. I'm talking about realized people and have some understanding of exactly what's going on. But also, I think people who are fully realized are able to see things about the subtle body that we can't. But we just, a very general sense of what subtle body means. That maybe we have some experience sometimes of energy and blockage in our body. There are Tibetan yoga practices that are designed to really make you much more aware of those energies and to ultimately be able to have some ability to work with them rather than having them, again, just be at the mercy of them, so to speak. So I think that that's where the understanding comes from. People who are able to actually have some insight and have some sense of what actually happens in the subtle body.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just assume that there are people who are enlightened enough, sensitive enough, present enough that they can experience what happens in the subtle body and what happens in the body altogether in death, and inform the survivors, the rest of us.
Yeah, a friend of mine actually just told me about the passing of his mother. He had taken care of her for quite some time after his father died, so he was very close to her, and he really lucked out. He had two people from hospice there that he just happened to meet. I mean, they're with him while she was dying, and there was some aware. One of the women was, because this is what she did with hospice. I mean, even though his mother couldn't communicate, she's dehydrating and couldn't speak anymore, couldn't eat. The hospice worker heard her. I mean, could actually communicate, could hear what was going on. Something like in the fifth dimension. I guess that's whatever the subtle body. So I just wonder if there aren't a lot of people, working in such a compassionate fashion in their lives, in situations like that may have those abilities.
That's what they tell us.
Yeah.
There are these people.
I think what is really clear, if you study it, is the description in the Book of the Dead of the dissolution of the elements in the body, where there's, starting from the earth element, that's the most solid, to the water, which is less solid, to the fire, to air, and finally dissolution into space. And that if you read the description of that, and you've had, been seeing somebody who's going through the dying process, then that is really clear, I think. Some of the internal things with the merging of the white and red bindus, that I think would take somebody with, who's, again, enlightened, has a degree of ability to perceive that, beyond what, most of us are capable of doing. But the dissolution process is really clear when you understand it.
I read a statement by the Dalai Lama that he contemplates the painful bardo of dying, with the dissolution of the elements, earth into water, water into fire, fire into air, air into space, that he contemplated that. I mean, I don't know if he's still doing it. This was some time ago that I read this, that he was doing it daily. And the reason that he was doing it was so that he would be prepared when he went through it and wouldn't be confused or frightened. He would know that it was coming this way.
Was that, did you find that out from the Dalai Lama's book on death?
No, it was from something else quite a long time ago.
Oh.
But it makes sense. I think it's Pamela Rinpoche who begins his book by saying, if you're going to a foreign country, you're going to read up on it, and so that you're not surprised when you get there, so you have some ability to find your way. And that's what we're doing when we study these teachings. Shinyi, you have any thoughts?
Oh, I'm just raising my hands.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so I just came across something interesting that I came across in the past few days. So I've heard, I forgot whether it's in this class or another class regarding Bardo, that a very young child, maybe like before the age of 5, they would sometimes, some kids would have a Bardo experience and they get very frightened. I haven't personally experienced this, but I was reading the biography of Khenpo Ngachong. He's supposedly an emanation of Vimalamitra, so I think his full name is Khenpo Ngawang Palzang. He wrote a commentary on the worst of my perfect teachers, great scholar and very realized master. In his biography, he wrote that when he was a very young kid, for a period of time, whenever he fall asleep, he would have what I'm seeing as a bodily experience of dissolution. So he said, when I fall asleep, I always hear thunder-like sound, and then all of a sudden it appears, I see the white light, like sun shining on snow mountain, and after a while the white light becomes a red light like sunset, and then all of a sudden the blue light is mixed with the white light, and I became kind of like I fainted, and then after a while I stay in a state of clarity and emptiness. And so he just went on to describe the experience, which really seems like the dissolution we were talking about, because John was talking about how you saw white light and then you saw red light and then you fainted when there's a black kind of darkness. So yeah, I just find it really interesting. So I want to share that. Yeah, anyways, that's it.
Thank you. In a similar vein, I think I mentioned this before, there are people who are called delogs, who have the ability to die, go to the realms of death and see dead people, who are still wandering around, I guess, and then come back. And there's actually a book called Delog, which describes the accounts of a number of people who do this. Look it up, Delog, D-E-L-O-G. I read it a long time ago, but it was interesting. So this is all about each one of us, what we're going to experience. Willy-nilly, whether we're prepared or not, we're going to experience some part of this. Any more comments? Because if not, we can just end a few minutes early. It's 6 minutes. What do you think, Michael?
Going once, going twice.
Anybody? Raise your hand. Can anything be more profound than to tell us what's going to happen to us after we die? There are people in this room who are getting close. Yeah. And there are people who were in this room who have already died. Well, shall we say the closing chants?
I can do that. We'll put them up, and then we'll go through our own dissolution and ending, or death of class. So we'll close, as always, with the dedication of the merit generated through our practice and study for the benefit of all sentient beings.
You want to mute all my...
Oh, I guess I should do that. I thought I had. All right, take two. We'll close with the dedication of merit accumulated through our practice and study for the benefit of all sentient beings. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rignan's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
you, Michael and John. That was
Thanks,
terrific.
Michael and John.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. So
Thank
much.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
So Michael,
Yes.
we should talk about next week. Should we just split that second chapter?
Sure.
It's long.
It is long. The whole beginning part on the Nidanas, and yeah, I know. There's quite a bit there.
Yeah, if you can, I searched around a bit on the internet for a graphic, showing the Nidanas.
Uh-huh.
I can't get anything that's very clear.
Yeah, I know that's the problem with even the picture in the book. It's, the wheel of life, but it's so condensed. I'll see if I can find something.
And I'll look to. Okay,
You want me to cover
I hope it's okay with you that I just felt like it was too much.
No, that's fine. I have no problem with it at all. No, I think it's fine. And I think it was good to go over it the way that, for people to hear all of it. Oh, we're still recording too.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Bye.
You can cut this last part out.